Hi, my name is Brian Tan, and I am a TMT partner with Pinson Masons in Singapore. Today, I'll be speaking at TMT and IP Disputes and Investigations 2021, and the topic that I'll be speaking on for the next 15 minutes is fighting the data wars. Now, if data is the new oil and we have fought vicious wars on oil, the question is, how will a data war look like and how would we fight that? I'm sure you know that Singaporean males have to serve a certain period in the military, known as national service. And from my time in the military, I can't say very much else more because it's classified. There are some elements that I've identified which we could learn some lessons from in this fight for data. And one of the things that we can share is from a guy, a general known as Sun Tzu, and from his Art of War, one of the famous things that he says is, know thyself, know thy enemy, 1,000 battles and 1,000 victories. So what does it take to know your enemy? Well, very often we think about the person who wants our data, and we think in terms of this person is our enemy. We think he's a computer nerd, wearing a hoodie, sitting in a dark room in front of a laptop, staring at a screen the whole day, lots of bits and bytes. But in actual fact, the person that we might be fighting against could be this. This young girl looks nothing like the hacker that we think she is, but she's one of the world's top 10 hackers. And as of 2017, she had accounted for $10 million in damages. The situation is further complicated today by the presence of state actors or state-sponsored actors. These guys hide behind countries. They enjoy the protection of countries. That makes the enforcement of criminal penalties, as well as extradition and mutual legal assistance treaties, quite toothless. Don't also forget that even in your own organizations, the insiders may be the persons that you face up against in your battle for data. And what could be some of the motivations of these parties? Sometimes it's easy, it's just financial. They want money, and so they get your data and they try to sell that, or they get your credit card and they put through charges. However, sometimes it's not so simple. In the case of identity theft, the criminals use the data for a future criminal purpose later on, and not from the outset when the data is taken. So example is the 2014 Carbonite attack, where the attackers got the credentials of ATM staff only to then use those credentials to get into those ATMs to dispense the cash in a coordinated attack throughout the world. Another motive could be revenge or hate, especially in terms of disgruntled ex-employees. And Shopify blamed its 2020 breach on rogue employees. Sometimes it's ideological, just because the hackers don't like the way that you operate. In 2015, an adult dating site specializing in putting unmarried people together called Ashley Madison was attacked by hackers who were unhappy with Ashley Madison's policies on the retention of data after a user had quit the site. Similarly, in 2014, Sony's massive hack was allegedly a result of unhappiness over an upcoming Sony movie about the assassination of a fictitious Korean dictator. But more often than not, it is really about human error, and in this case, carelessness. There you can see a laptop that's left, a bag that's left unattended, probably containing a laptop. Lost laptops accounted for 10,000 pieces of equipment containing data in every year. So very much different motivations, but nevertheless, all of them need to be defended. So what does an incident typically entail? First, it requires the detection of that particular breach, and then an identification of the data that has been involved, identification possibly of the parties and their motivations. An assessment will then be required to, will be carried out for the purposes of deciding whether a notification is required and further action is required. Then the notification takes place. We'll talk a little bit about that further on, followed by remediation. How do you ensure that that particular breach is contained and does not spread? Then the action moves to the prevention. How do you then prevent that next breach from happening? And finally, a reflection on your processes. Going on to mandatory breach notification, this is a fairly recent development in Asia. A lot of it is inspired by Europe's GDPR, but it typically involves the notification of the regulator here, the PDPC, if there's significant harm and scale, and also of the data subjects, the individuals that are involved, if significant harm is involved. Now, there are regulations which now set up which data would be deemed to cause significant harm. So that's pretty clear now. As mentioned, you have a fixed period for assessment that would be 30 days. And then after that assessment is formed, and if you do need to notify, you have 3 days to do so. That's 72 hours, similar to the standard imposed by the GDPR. You can consider voluntary statutory undertakings where your breach management and breach notification plans are then put into execution while investigations are stayed. And if there are exceptions, if remedial action has already taken place, no notification is required. Where technological protection has been put on the data that has been exfiltrated, again, no notification will be required. Finally, financial penalties are now pretty eye-watering. They are the higher of 10% of annual Singapore turnover or $1 million. Remember, the higher of. The threshold question of whether it's a breach or not relates all down to this particular definition. Notice there are two limbs. The second limb clearly covers the case where the laptop has been lost. So you have no idea whether it was stolen or was lost, and that laptop was unencrypted. But in the first case, which is your typical hacking case, a lot of the scenarios that we talked about would fall under this. Arguably, even if ransomware is involved, that would also involve the unauthorized access by the perpetrators of your data and would also be defined as a data breach. So moving on quickly to ransomware. The issue with ransomware would be this. Is it illegal to make payments to the perpetrators in order to obtain the decryption keys? The US Treasury has offered some guidance that it's possibly illegal if the hackers have been sanctioned, even if the payer did not know this fact. Now, given that the hackers are usually anonymous and would take great pains to remain anonymous, the question then would be, how would the payer satisfy himself that they have not been sanctioned? That would make it extremely high bar to cross, and that should be a significant factor in mind if you are thinking of making payments for ransomware. Most regulators, in any case, discourage that because they state that the payment of ransomware is usually ineffective. In Hong Kong, Australia, and Singapore, terrorism financing and anti-money laundering laws possibly ban the payment of ransomware. In Malaysia, terrorism financing laws actually make that illegal. Then the question also remains how to make that payment. Typically, those payments require some form of cryptocurrency, if that's legal in the country. And second, how do you then ensure that the person that you're paying that money to would keep up his end of the bargain? He's, after all, a criminal. There are services out there that assist in such payment, and such services can even offer some form of verification whether other clients have faced similar issue with that particular perpetrator. Others have suggested that insurance may be the solution. I do have to add that some countries are now considering banning insurance from paying off ransomware. Another issue is enforcement hold. It's a US concept, and this concept allows the notification to be suspended in order to not jeopardize the investigations of the regulator. Similar concepts do apply in other jurisdictions. For instance, to avoid tipping off, notification is then suspended in order to allow investigations to proceed. In Singapore, the legislation specifically allows or disallows notification to individuals if a prescribed law agency so instructs. Notice that this is a limited prohibition of notification, and it requires a prescribed law enforcement agency, which might not extend to foreign law enforcement agencies. Now, do remember again that the process of remediation means that you are fighting a war, not a battle. And all is not over once a notification is made. There's still the cleaning of the system, right? To clear the system of the perpetrator so that the exfiltration of information does not keep recurring. Containing the breach to make sure that the breach does not become even wider. How do you retrieve the data that's already out there? Right? How do you also minimize the damage? One popular method would be to sign up all the customers to a credit monitoring service. And we had a lot of companies taking this option. A little blimp did appear in the road when Equifax, which is a popular credit monitoring services, announced its own data breach. So that kind of gave clients a little bit of pause before recommending credit monitoring services as part of their remediation. Some companies also monitor the dark web, and this is to monitor to see whether their data appears for sale on the dark web. Sometimes if the perpetrators can be identified, especially when in the case of insider work, the perpetrators are then pursued in order to bring them to justice and in order to force them to hand over the data that they've already gotten their hands on. Finally, Sun Tzu says, know thyself. Have your breach management plan ready. Have your incident response plan ready. Have your PR communications plan ready. This is all stuff that you can prepare beforehand. Do consider the voluntary statutory undertakings that we talked about earlier. And conduct annual tabletop exercises so that you familiarize yourself with your plans and you update your plans as scenarios as the business changes. Even better still, consider cyber very much a military term where a digital twin of your digital assets and your network is built and then tested against specific attacks for their responses as well as management responses to these scenarios. With this, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me. I'll be happy to take questions. And if you want further information about what we do in terms of breach response, I'll be happy to respond if you can drop me a line at the email mentioned at the start. Thank you very much.